Hello, good evening, and thank you for joining us here at the New America Foundation for what promises to be a really interesting conversation. My name is Andres Martinez. I direct the Bernard Schwartz Fellows Program here at New America. The Schwartz Program seeks to support the research of independent-minded individuals whose research informs public policy debates by bringing, hopefully, fresh thinking to policy discussions. And Evgeny, we're very proud to have Evgeny Morozov as one of our Schwartz Fellows this year, and I think he's a poster child for our ambition of fresh thinking and courageous minds that challenge conventional wisdom. And when I say poster child, I mean that somewhat literally, because Evgeny was born in 1984, which is apropos of our title and the mention of Orwell. So. But he is wise, well beyond his years, as you will see. We're here to celebrate the publication of the Net Delusion, Evgeny's book that's out this week. We're also fortunate to have Susan Glasser as part of this conversation. Susan is the editor of Foreign Policy magazine, where she's done a masterful job with that magazine and really bringing it online in ways that have really become a must-read in this town. And she's also responsible for disseminating Evgeny's thinking, because Evgeny is also a contributing editor at Foreign Policy, where he writes the Net Effect blog. Susan, as many of you know, is a former bureau chief for the Washington Post in Moscow, former national editor there. She's the author of Kremlin Rising, Vladimir Putin's Russia and the End of Revolution. And also, Susan's a great neighbor. New America and Foreign Policy have adjacent space here, and I think that's really been helpful to a lot of the collaborations that we've had, most prominently around the AFPAC channel. So bricks and mortar geography still matters in this world. A couple of housekeeping notes. I just wanted to remind everybody that we're being webcast live, so this is on the record. Obviously, Susan and Evgeny are aware of that, but be mindful when you ask questions. And when you do so at the end, wait for the microphone and please identify yourself. Also, this will be on C-SPAN. And we're going to have some refreshments at the end, so hopefully the discussion will continue then. Please join us. We also have lying about some forms that you may have seen that are a forecasting contest for 2011. Last year's winner was a college student who came to one of our events, dropped in. So if you are a college kid ringer who has a better sense of the future, this is your chance to show up our think tank colleagues here, and we'll buy you dinner a year from now. And for those of you who are watching this on the web or on C-SPAN, just to give you a flavor of our very serious forecasting contest, one of the questions is, which South will make more appearances in the New York Times in 2011, South Korea, South Carolina, South America, or South Park? So think about it. With that, I think we've covered everything, and I just wanted to hand this off to Susan Glasser, who will proceed with this great conversation with Evgeny. Thanks.
Thanks, Andres. And my answer is South Korea. So we'll see how we do there. No, thank you so much for that terrific introduction and for giving us a platform tonight to talk about Evgeny's book, which I, based on my experience over the last 2 years, is guaranteed to provoke, enrage, disturb, and deeply upset half of the audience. So we'll figure out by the end which half are the cyber utopians and which half are the cyber realists with us tonight. But no, I couldn't be more delighted and to congratulate Evgeny on the publication of this book, which has been interesting for me and for all of us at Foreign Policy to take shape over the last couple years. In many ways, we've watched sort of the live action on the internet evolution of Evgeny's thinking, such that we've gone from the early days a couple of years ago where Evgeny was sort of out there wondering and thinking and perhaps hoping that there was something called a Twitter revolution occurring in Moldova. Flash forward to today, not only are we here to celebrate the publication of his book, The Net Delusion, The Dark Side of Internet Freedom, which kind of tells you where he came down on that, I'm reminded once again of how circular our conversations are. And, here we have the would-be Twitter revolution in Tunisia, according to Andrew Sullivan, just this very afternoon. So I think I'm looking forward to sort of jumping right into the middle of the conversation with Evgeny about these subjects. But I have to ask you first about Tunisia. Can we ever have a Twitter revolution in your estimation, or is it really just we have to give up in order to really become cyber realists? We have to give up all of our utopian and revolutionary fantasies about the liberating power of the internet.
Well, I think much depends on what exactly you mean by Twitter revolution. If you look at what happened in Moldova, the initial premise there was that Twitter and social media were actually instrumental in getting people into the streets. Later on, some people, myself included, began wondering maybe the actual impact was in publicizing what was happening in Moldova and getting it on the front page of the New York Times, which happened, and that happened mostly thanks to Twitter, because back then it was still a very new technology. It was 2009, and it seemed like a very novel event. I mean, you fast forward to now, and you see similar somewhat events happening in Tunisia, also being widely covered on Twitter, but it took 4 weeks for the New York Times to run a story, in part because Twitter is no longer in the news. So it's very hard to think about what a Twitter revolution is when we have this very constantly changing definitions. If you look at Iran and the Twitter revolution there, the initial premise was that, again, it was instrumental in mobilizing people. That's almost a direct quote from Andrew Sullivan, who made a lot from those events, and he publicized them on his blog, and he was the one who basically, I think, shaped the coverage of the events to a great extent. Later, of course, many people, just like in the case of Moldova, modified their position, saying that, well, it probably wasn't used to mobilize, but it still helped to generate headlines that eventually made it to CNN. Again, it was 2009, and that novelty factor more or less wore off. There are still people watching the events in Tunisia via Twitter, and they're still blogging and reblogging and retweeting everything they see, but I haven't seen much proof. And not that, it is available yet. Maybe it will emerge later that, Twitter or any other technology was, the driver of events in Tunisia. It probably helped. And the fact that the government has been constantly hacking into the accounts of activists, they have been hacking into their Facebook accounts, into their Gmail, which was a very surprising tactic that I haven't encountered before. That probably attests that social media was playing some role in Tunisia. I'm just not sure that it is the driver that many people expect it to be. But it still mattered. It still does.
So go back in time then a little bit. Tell us about why you decided to write the book, and what your own journey from cyber utopianism was to today, and a much more realistic take on what the internet can deliver in terms of political freedom.
Sure. Well, I was born and raised in Belarus.
Not in Chernobyl, but
no, but close, about 200 miles maybe, in a small mining town actually. So we had our own environmental problem. So I was born and raised there, and of course, the subject of democratization and the subject of democracy promotion was always dear to me, in part because I always watched very closely the Western response to what was happening in Belarus. And to a large extent, that response was never satisfactory, at least as far as I was concerned. So back in, I would say, 2005, when there was a lot of buzz in the world about the role that blogs and new media can play in bringing political change. And remember, that was just a year or so, or maybe even less, after the presidential elections here. Everyone was still talking about what Howard Dean managed to accomplish with social media, and there was a lot of hope that blogs and social networks would actually be instrumental in helping people to mobilize and get out into the streets. You also, just in terms of the context, you also have to remember that there was still a lot of enthusiasm about the color revolutions. There was still this feeling, particularly in my part of the world, that social media would help. Well, not social media, but that the protests, the people power, so to say, was on the rise,
Right.
and that it happened in Serbia, in Georgia, in Ukraine. People in 2006 expected the same thing to happen in Belarus. Something happened in Kyrgyzstan. So there was definitely this excitement that the protests will continue, and you put the rising power of social media in this very bright future of the freedom agenda, and you end up with a pretty solid, as it seemed to me, assumption that social media and new media as such will actually play a huge role in democratizing the world. So my first gig after college was actually working with an NGO based in Prague on using new media and to promote media change, but also to promote democratic reform in the former Soviet space. I worked for an NGO called Transitions Online, and eventually I became their director of new media. So my job was actually traveling around the region, meeting with bloggers, activists, journalists who were mostly in the opposition, and talking to them about the power of new media, how they can use blogs, how they can use social networks to mobilize people to, it was a very optimistic kind of NGO-ish take on how you can actually put the internet to good use. Not necessarily for street protests, but also for small things like publicizing corruption or blogging about the environment. I mean, it all differed from a country to country. And I spent roughly 3 years, 2.5 years doing that, getting to know very closely a lot of the funders who were actually working in this space. I actually got to know a lot of people who were eager to fund whatever remained of the freedom agenda, whether it was National Endowment for Democracy, whether it was Internews, whether it was Open Society Institute. So I got to know a lot of people who back then were making assumptions about the power of the internet that I myself found reasonable. And I spent 3 years doing that. By the end of my stint, I started seeing that not only were some of our projects not having the desired outcome, many of them actually were making things worse, in part because I think there was very little thought put into the right development models that you need for creating successful new media projects. What happened is that most of these post-Soviet countries had a lot of talented bloggers and new media entrepreneurs who were already innovating on their own. Then you had all of those U.S. agencies coming in with a lot of money and distorting the incentives up to a point where they literally stopped innovating until they got another grant. And they would, be innovating at a slightly different speed, knowing that they can get another grant if they fail in the first phase. Mm-hmm. So I started having a lot of second thoughts about the viability of the model by which, many of these NGOs and many of these countries were introduced to the power of social media. So that was kind of the first alarm. But then I also started looking a bit closely at how the governments themselves were responding to the internet. And if at the very beginning it was very boring standard response of censorship, all they were doing was banning pages and banning certain URLs, some banning certain keywords in URLs. Over those 3 years I spent doing this work, I realized that their response was becoming much more sophisticated. And now it involved cyber attacks on the websites of their opponents. It involved hiring and paying new media entrepreneurs and bloggers to create their own pro-government projects. It involved buying technology from the West to engage in online surveillance of many of these activists and bloggers. In the case of Russia, for example, you actually had an oligarch very close to the Kremlin buy out the entire LiveJournal company, which was the leading platform and still is in Russia, which came as somewhat of a shock because there was still a lot of it was an American company with a lot of American and foreign users, and suddenly that happened and many people I think rightly so, began to expect that there will be a lot of negative changes with new ownership on LiveJournal.
Right. And nobody was chronicling any of this?
Very little of that was chronicled. I mean, the harder side of the repression was chronicled. So we began to see more studies about internet filtering, internet censorship. Right. Those more sophisticated ways were covered somewhat, but I don't think that there was any systematic overview of what was happening. No one was examining them on a case-by-case basis. And this is more or less how I came to this subject and this new set of assumptions, because I just realized that there was something fundamentally wrong with the whole paradigm in which many people in this town were making decisions about the power of new media, but also in terms of assumptions that they make about the government's response, the authoritarian government's response to the internet, but also the ways in which the locals would be using it for what kind of purposes, and and how it will actually undermine or not the existing political regimes. So I decided to take more time off and focus more on the journalistic end of this, to cover the space as much as I could as a freelancer. But also I started working on this book, and so that's more or less how I came to this. It was all through more or less empirical work of me getting to know many of these problems firsthand as someone who worked for an NGO, and eventually transitioning to a more analytical position.
Do you think that it was the Green Revolution in Iran that was sort of the key tipping point for your own views, when you really sort of came to see the consequences of getting it wrong analytically?
It was definitely a tipping point in terms of understanding that there are a lot of erroneous assumptions about the internet in Washington. It was definitely understanding that there is something that I found very politically naive in terms of how the U.S. government viewed this space. But initial doubts about the power of the internet cropped much earlier. That would be 2007, early 2008, where I really began examining the space in earnest analytically. But I never had much of a connection to the U.S. government's side of this until, I would say, 2009, and in part because I think there was not actually much of an engagement from the U.S. government to the internet until then. I mean, the agencies, of course, were funding, and again, USAID and the Internews and all others were, of course, active in this space since probably year 2000, if not earlier. It was never systematized and in any kind of internet freedom agenda, and I'm not sure that there was any strategic big master plan for what's actually being accomplished. Most of those projects that involve new media, my understanding at least is, they fit into the broader kind of political and social projects that they were implementing in those countries. So it was just an add-on to what they were already doing. But I think with the election of Obama and with the kind of worship of all things new media that characterized his campaign, I think there was much more of a push in terms of trying to explore the digital space for more strategically. So in 2009, we began seeing this technology delegations of American executives going on trips to foreign countries to try to sell American technology to local leaders. I mean, the first of those was, I think, in 2009 in spring to Iraq. Could be a bit earlier. Then, of course, there was this famous outreach from the State Department to Twitter during the protests in Iran, which I also make a lot of in the book. Eventually, it all came down to the internet freedom speech of Hillary Clinton in January 2010. Which was just the final point that convinced me that this book and this project needs a second dimension, which is not just examining how authoritarian governments respond to the internet, but how the American government and the American political establishment thinks about the power of the internet, but also thinks about how to use the internet for their own agenda and for their own policies.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think there's a lot of sort of edge to your book when you get around to this idea that in its own way, your argument is, in its own way, the internet freedom agenda is as miscast as Bush's initial freedom agenda was, in the sense of the unintended consequences, almost certainly, of labeling this as a U.S. government policy. I think that's something that most people aren't familiar with that argument, but once they start to wrap their heads around it and they think, wow, has the Obama administration succeeded in politicizing something that up until now, sort of all the bad guys around the world, they themselves were seeing this as a tool and not as an instrument of national power projection by the United States.
Sure.
You know, is that how you think the bad guys look at Google and Gmail now in a way that they didn't 2 years ago?
Yes, but actually I would like to expand more on your remarks, because I think you're actually hitting the key issue here. You know, of course, we all know that there was a lot of support that the U.S. government was giving to democracy and freedom, you know, before it became the freedom agenda.
Before you put a label on it.
And I think more or less, as I've just outlined up until now, there was already a lot of work that the U.S. government and various agencies and, you know, foundations were actually doing in this new media space before the emergence of, you know, digital diplomacy or internet freedom as, you know, buzzwords, right? So what I think happened inadvertently is that the U.S. government just overshot the mark. I mean, they really thought that, you know, probably the State Department thought that they do have the means to shape the global debate about internet freedom by sort of raising their voice and raising the pitch of their voice also on this issue. I think, however, it was a misguided effort for, you know, numerous things, for numerous reasons. And also, before I get into that, I think we also have to remember that freedom agenda itself, internet freedom agenda itself, it was never really expounded to any lens other than in that speech. I mean, and that speech itself is much, you know, there is much more rhetoric than actual frameworks and, you know, policy proposals to that speech. But the problem is that that speech eventually, that's how the global public at least reacts to it, it is examined in conjunction with all of the other policies of the U.S. government and the State Department, of which, for example, this technology delegations that I mentioned earlier is one. And, you know, the several, or at least one big dinner that Hillary Clinton hosted, for example, at the State Department for CEOs of Silicon Valley companies. You know, so there are all of those events which technically are not related to Internet Freedom Agenda, but they get lumped into one once you start looking at it, because it's all the same actors involved. You know, it's Google, which is present in, you know, the big cyber attacks in China story. It's also Google, whose CEO goes to Iraq to digitize the archives of the Iraqi National Museum. I mean, so many of the stories, they basically interconnect in ways that I think the government did not foresee. But my bigger problem with the Internet Freedom, you know, agenda, if you want to call it that, is that they just didn't succeed in building you know, any reasonable connections to the rest of the U.S. government's policy on the internet. And, you know, it became obvious during the U.S. government's response to WikiLeaks, which, you know, many people in the world took to be extremely hypocritical. You know, and again, here I don't want to be unfair to the U.S. government. Many of the calls to, you know, get WikiLeaks off Amazon servers came from, you know, senators and, you know, the American radio talk shows and whatnot. It didn't come from, you know, someone at the State Department. But most people in the world still interpreted it as a very hypocritical speech. And now, you know, I'll track the reaction. Many people actually, for the first time, read the speech after WikiLeaks happened, because they realized that it just didn't correspond. Many of the positions expressed in the speech didn't correspond to the actual actions and the climate of debate in America. So, and it's not the only element. I mean, if you look at other...
just to clarify on WikiLeaks, because I think people will be interested.
Sure.
Okay, so you're saying that the Internet Freedom Agenda isn't really compatible with how the government has perhaps understandably responded to WikiLeaks. What's your own view about WikiLeaks and whether, you know, that represents some disturbing new trend? Is that something we should welcome? How does it fit into your analysis?
You know, it definitely fits into it very nicely from the cyber utopian angle. Because I think, and it's very, I must acknowledge it from the very beginning, it's very hard to discuss WikiLeaks because it's something we're moving, I mean, it's a bit of an analogy now, but it's, you know, it's not they do not have a coherent identity.
Yeah.
Right? So they keep changing. And in the 4 years that they've been around, they probably revamped the entire conceptual model, 4 or 5, or I don't know how many times. So if you look at their initial approach, that I think was extremely cyber-utopian. They, like many others in the business community and the political community, reason that Wikipedia is the guide to success in the modern world. Everyone will be collaborating online. People will come together. They all have enough time. They just sit there and they're just waiting for data and documents to be dumped on them. And if you look at some of the early statements from Assange and now his comments in 2010 describing his views back then, you do feel that he also bought into this, the wiki world of collaborative journalism and people coming together and collaborating and doing the stuff that newspapers used to do. I think if you look at it now, it's a completely different ideology where all of the cables are published by the mainstream media. They all some of them are vetted, most of them are vetted by journalists, and so forth. So they have definitely evolved in terms of their approach to the relationship between information and change, political or social, and I think that change has been in the right direction. On the other hand, I still do not fully understand what value WikiLeaks as an organization brings to a problem. I mean, their core asset is the technology which allows people to upload documents anonymously. And that this technology can be replicated by any newspaper in a matter of days. It wouldn't cost a lot to replicate that technology, right? And if you want to build a secure, submit a WikiLeaks section on Foreign Policy's website, it will be very easy to do. So
Great.
the question,
we'll talk.
so the question then is, where do they add value? And you can make the argument that they add value in having the networks through which they can contact media and journalists and NGOs. And there are probably some global problems on which they can make the argument that they have superior networks to everyone else. But for local leaks, if you really want to leak something about corruption in Azerbaijan,
right.
chances are, you know what to look at, right? And as we've seen, the fact that the Washington Post carries a front-page story about corruption in Azerbaijan doesn't really cause much of a difference back in Azerbaijan. But that's that's a different subject. But my point is that it's not really clear to me what's the future, because I do not see what is the value that WikiLeaks adds to the process. And here they may just be falling the victim of the internet, which is more or less all about disrupting intermediaries and getting them out of business. Right? So if you compare them to this new emerging model of open leaks, they have, even though they haven't properly launched yet, their ideology is that we'll actually start building those widgets for newspapers. So they would be able to introduce our widget on the newspaper website and have people upload documents, and they will play sort of a less prominent role that WikiLeaks wants to play. But to me, again, the future of WikiLeaks itself is not certain. That's why, for example, last week I did in a piece for the New Republic, I argued that Assange should probably actually become a leader of a movement for rebuilding the internet infrastructure and and making it less dependent on commercial companies, and potentially and because that movement is already emerging. You do see a lot of projects which want to remake the domain name management system, or they want to remake payment systems, or they want to remake the hosting system. So many of these new projects are emerging, and all of them are emerging to a great extent because of the reaction of the U.S. government to WikiLeaks. People have suddenly understood that it's probably not safe to have the U.S. government be the most powerful country on the internet and have American companies to be the most powerful intermediaries, because once someone crosses the interests of the U.S. government, they would be able to pursue them through the American companies. So there are a lot of interesting bottom-up projects in Europe which seek to address that puzzle. So a role for Assange, for example, may be to work more on those projects than on the leaks themselves. So there are all sorts of options, I think, on this table right now. Their usefulness remains to be seen.
Well, that's right. And you actually point out a very interesting consequence we haven't talked that much about. We've talked mostly about sort of the U.S. piece of this, but what are the consequences of looking at the world of internet activism more through this cyber realist lens that you propose? We're talking about a sort of renationalization in many ways of the internet. So instead of Google as a sort of universal, neutral, player, fine, you've analyzed sort of they remain a U.S. company, they have U.S. Values, good and bad, but there are some starkly, potentially very negative consequences that come about if you proceed down the road here. Does Turkey gets its own national email system and that sort of thing? What do you see happening as a result of people being newly conscious of this U.S. role and owning the internet space?
So I think there are two factors here. First, as we already discussed, is this attempt to embrace the power of Silicon Valley in terms of promoting freedom and democracy, whether it's through outreach to Twitter or to Facebook. I mean, there is definitely this fear that Twitter is just a cover-up for regime change, right? Which many governments, and again, I'm simplifying quite a bit, but this is how some governments perceive American technology at this point. The second aspect here is that, and this brings us back to the inherent contradictions in the Internet Freedom Agenda, is that American law enforcement and intelligence gathering agencies actually also want to remake the internet, and they want to re-engineer it so that it's easier for them to eavesdrop on online conversations and to engage in surveillance. And you got the director of FBI recently touring Silicon Valley, asking the same Silicon Valley companies that are supposed to promote internet freedom around the globe to build backdoors into the systems. And so what you end up with is governments concerned about the fact that American technology may simply be unreliable, and that it may eventually lead to Washington, and their conversations may actually be monitored, right? So as a result, I think what is happening is that there is definitely an effort, and I think it's a trend that I see in countries like Russia, China, and Russia, where and Turkey, as you've mentioned, where there is a lot of talk about trying to replicate some of the key functions needed in the information society. It's email, search, maybe social networking, even though I doubt that they'll come to social networking. But email and search, for example, now there is definitely a push in some of those countries to cultivate national champions who would be able to do it all domestically, store all the data in the country, and comply with local laws, and respond to any demands that would come from the national governments. So instead of, and again, some of this we're also beginning to see was the kind of problems that, Research in Motion, the parent company of BlackBerry, is saying. Governments want to keep that data at home. They do not want that data to go elsewhere because they want to have access to it whenever they need. So there is definitely this element of governments rebuilding email systems and search engines. The second trend that I'm seeing is growing uneasiness about using American software. So you have, for example, it was very interesting that Putin in Russia, for example, in mid-December signed this very long executive order ordering that all of the Russian public institutions switch to open source systems by 2015. Some of it is driven by economic considerations for sure, because it's cheaper, but again, you'll have to retrain people. I mean, there are some costs also. But my understanding is that such efforts are driven mostly by fears that proprietary software is just, it's harder to monitor its code if you compare it to open source versions. And open source versions just minimize the risks that the software might contain backdoors leading to America. So now you have the Iranian Minister of Information last week announcing that they want to build an open source operating system because they fear, and they fear for a good reason, that some of their nuclear facilities may be compromised if it all runs on proprietary Western software. And again, we all know that because we already had this problem with their malware last year. So and then it's not just Russia and China. We are beginning Russia and Iran. It's I see some signs of that happening in China as well. So I mean, the response, I think, of this government is it's pretty logical and straightforward. It's trying to maintain, as it's a very popular term now, information sovereignty. You know, they want to lessen the dependence on both hardware and software. But the same is happening in America, where in the European Union, where governments are also reluctant to buy hardware from Chinese firms because they fear exactly the same thing. They fear that there will be backdoors, right? So some of it is driven by just fears and nationalism, but the fact that now we also have this additional regime change kind of factor with the Internet freedom agenda. It's an additional fear. I think it will just make it easier for many governments to decide that they no longer want to deal with American technology.
So just to pull back to sort of the high altitude questions that the book raises, this is an American audience. The book is largely pitched at an American audience. We are by nature cyber utopians, right? We've been taught this is now our second decade of believing that the internet is transforming our world very largely to the good, even if in perplexing and disruptive ways. Where do you come down at this point, and recognizing you might be evolving too in your views on this? Okay, so what's wrong with having an anti-corruption website in Azerbaijan, or an environmental blog in Russia, or mobilizing people in outside Iran to support the protest movement?
Sure.
This is clearly, it is a powerful tool for any kind of political expression, organization, or activity as we know it here in the United States. So what's wrong with that? I mean, aren't you falling prey to a certain extent to the very thing that you're critiquing, which is this is a tool after all. It can be good, it can be bad.
Well, I should make an additional probably disclaimer. I mean, I also am affiliated and I sit on one of the boards of the Open Society Institute, now Open Society Foundation, on the board of the information program, where all we do
so you're
is
not
basically
against democratization.
No. I mean, where all we do is basically spend a lot of George Soros's money to try to understand how you actually use the information and technology to open up many of the countries that need opening up. So to me, there is really no question that the internet can be used for good and for democratization. So many of the initiatives you mentioned, anti-corruption websites, websites monitoring environmental degradation, raising awareness about what's happening, all of them are good, in themselves. The question really is, from the perspective of someone with limited resources, how do you, and someone also who, and here I'm talking about the U.S. government, and someone who also carries a lot of political and historical baggage that is likely to be interpreted in certain ways, in some countries more than others. I mean, any talk of any revolution in Iran, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or whatever, is probably not a good idea when there is an American person saying that, right? American government person saying that. So my question really is, it's not, how do you, as someone who has good intentions, a relative amount of, funding and, some space to work in, how do you actually maximize the potential of the internet while minimizing the, the impact that your own reputation or public image or, previous history of, foreign policy blunders are likely to have on your strategy? This is why I'm trying to outline this strategy of cyber realism in the book, because I think that right now our entire paradigm of thinking about internet and change is wrong, because it's just full of assumptions which are no longer tenable. And most of those assumptions are assumptions about how the internet works in the abstract. Yes, it opens up governments, it transforms change, but if you know nothing about how a country like Azerbaijan or Tajikistan or pick any country that is not in the news every day, if you don't know much about the cultural, religious, political, and social forces transforming that country, it's unlikely that you'll realize the kind of impact that the internet is likely to have on it. Right? So part of my agenda in the book is to transform this debate from attention on the impact of the internet in the abstract to the impact of the internet on particular context and environments. So my urge is actually to start with the context and environments and forget theorizing about the logic of the internet, because to a large extent, that logic will be shaped by what's happening locally, and it's to the local conditions that we need to be much more attentive. And if you come to a country like Russia and you think that there are good guys who are fighting the government, and then there are the bad guys, and there is nothing in between, and you just analyze how it empowers the government and how it empowers, disempowers the bad guys, you just miss 99% of the kind of changes that the internet is introducing into Russia. So you have to consider how it affects the role of religion, or the role of nationalism, the role of nationalism of the titular nation versus ethnic minorities in Russia, the relations within the center and the periphery. All of those will be transformed by the internet. I'm actually the guy who's saying that the internet is transforming everything.
Right. Just not always to the good, is your point.
Yes, it's just that, it's not transforming everything for the good, because many of those processes are not by themselves, enhancing democratization. So yes, many of them will be amplified. But before we get to this point where we can proclaim that the internet is a force for democratization, we first need to examine the exact political, cultural, and social context that it's supposed to transform. And of course, since all countries are different, we are bound to end up with different policies, which will never be able to aggregate into a single internet freedom agenda. I mean, to me, that seems straightforward. Right? So the problem is that there are differences, and there are institutional and procedural differences in terms of how you can approach this space. Now, you can get a lot of very smart people, very knowledgeable about technology, to spend their days thinking very hard about how technology will transform Russia, Egypt, Tunisia. Or you can do the exact opposite. You can start with people who know something about Russia, Tunisia, or Egypt to think very hard how the internet, will do that. I kind of side with the camp that we'd rather empower the regional experts than with the technologies, because I don't think that there is so much complexity in what the internet does. It lowers transaction costs. It makes it easier for people to communicate and access information. I mean, that's it. You just don't know how exactly those three factors are likely to affect a particular environment unless you know what that environment is like.
Well, that's almost as good a place as any to bring in your voices as well, to hear what you have to say about this, because I think it's one of those conversations that we're going to be having 5 years from now and 10 years from now too. Well, I'm really struck by in many ways the parallels between the sort of examples you're giving of sort of the internet facilitates Stalin cultists in Russia as much as it facilitates, or perhaps more than it facilitates, Western democracy activists in Russia, right? And look at Al-Qaeda on the internet, I think, is a good example. That fundamentally challenges our notions here of, the internet is a force for good. Well, it also turns out to be an incredibly effective tool for facilitating the work of a small underground group that wishes to communicate anonymously across countries and continents, right, for their work. And I think we've come to the realization of that over the last few years in a way that probably wasn't immediately obvious in 2003 and 2004 and that sort of thing. So if we can get your questions, we will try to do as many as we can while we still have time. We'll start here in the front row and hope to move backwards as quickly as we can. Do you give us your name and your organization? Sure.
Hi, Robert Schroeder, international investor. Thank you for the talk and the book. Just today, we saw that there was a report out that our own government has been requesting the Twitter records to see those that may have been looking for WikiLeaks information. There was also a report mentioned today that Senate subcommittee is upset that apparently there has been some cyber attacks, cyber offense directed by some members of our intelligence community against other nations that they were not informed of before these tests were conducted. So we are undoubtedly seeing that our own government is getting involved in this. Do you see that there'll be any efforts made to restrain our own government in the future? And how would you say that this balances out against what you fear other governments might be doing?
Efforts by whom? You mean the U.S. government? Whom do you expect to restrain the U.S. government?
Well, Congress in some form.
Okay. I mean, it's a tough one. I mean, there are definitely signs that the U.S. government is much more concerned about the impact of the internet on national security than it ever was up until now, in part because of WikiLeaks, in part because now they suddenly discovered that there are a lot of people around the globe who, just with the help of their computer, can launch a cyber attack on a site like PayPal and actually take it down. And that was just amateurs. Those were not. It's not organized crime. It's a bunch of 15-year-olds mostly in Europe and elsewhere who just feel passionate about WikiLeaks. So there is definitely, I think, this new awareness of the potential threat that the internet poses. I'm just not sure that the Congress is any less, jingoist, if you want to put it in those terms, about the internet. I mean, you get, the person who actually is extremely, I think, concerned about the internet and who has been, calling for an internet kill switch, to have a button to turn it off, to, prosecute anyone connected with WikiLeaks is, Joe Lieberman. So you do get, I mean, I just don't think that if this change will come, it will come from Congress. They appear actually much more aggressive here than the government itself, and they are the ones who are accusing Department of Justice of a very weak reaction to Assange. It's very. I think if anything, the change will come probably, and the pressure will come from some of the geeks who are not yet part of big companies. I mean, there are still a lot of very influential people in Silicon Valley who are concerned with the direction in which it is going. Many of them are speaking up. I mean, I don't know if the pressure of civil society be enough, but as Lawrence Lessig said a few years ago, I mean, all it will take for the U.S. to pass an I-Patriot Act is an I-9/11. And I don't think that situation has changed for the better. If anything, it has changed for the worse. So my response is, we have as much power to shape that as we had in shaping the Patriot Act. And so I'm not particularly enthusiastic, but I also don't think that there is much pressure that you can expect to come from abroad. It's not that Russia or China will be speaking up, or the European Union is in a war often with American companies when it comes to their data and privacy policies, but they are as supportive of the U.S. efforts on cyber war and cyber warfare. I mean, much of it happens on the NATO level, through various cybersecurity centers which are now popping up in the European states. And if you actually want to look even deeper, you look at a country like Estonia, which now has a volunteer cyber army during peacetime. So they have a bunch of geeks who call themselves, that's an official entity as far as I understand, call themselves a cyber army. And if there is another wave of cyber attacks, they'll come to the defense of, which may not be a bad idea, but I don't think that Europeans are any less, aggressive when it comes to taming the cyberspace than Americans.
Right, that's the next stop. The next Congress action is going to be to create the Cyber Reserve Force for the military. More questions, please.
Of the Cyber Peace Corps.
Right, probably not that one. Yes, here.
Yeah, Chen, freelance correspondent, Bethesda, Maryland. Now, the most important issue and the controversy is the global warming. I would like to suggest what would be the strategy for the pros or cons group to utilize the internet to their own advantage. And also now, the internet is become the national sovereign issue. So that means each country circulate their own information, and this is going to be very harmful to the international relation? Thank you.
Well, as far as I understood, the initial question, it was about the way in which opponents and proponents of climate change can use the internet to battle it out. Is it more or less the? You do see a lot of denialism happening on many scientific issues, not just climate change, facilitated by new media. Some of that is debunked very quickly. Some of that sticks around and is used by various entities. Some of that is planted deliberately by various lobbyists and think tanks and who's not. So on the level of information and misinformation, of course, that is happening. You'll probably remember that probably the biggest subject of debate in the last 12 months related to climate change was a bunch of emails that were leaked because of a hack on a server, a university server in England. So we'll definitely be seeing more efforts to manipulate the evidence. Or to present the evidence as genuine when it's not. But all of that applies, I think, universally across many subjects, not just climate change. So it's just that in this new environment, you do need to take much more thoughtful and careful protection about your networks, about your information. But I think the consequence of this, especially as it applies to WikiLeaks, will be the return of digital rights management. It will be documents which can only be read by one particular party on one particular computer. Others will not be able to share them. And there is an interesting startup which actually raised something like $30 million just yesterday on the idea of providing documents with a more secure digital rights system. So I think some of that will come in, but I don't see anything specific with regards to climate change per se, other than cloud computing contributes heavily to it because all of the servers are generating a lot of energy. But other than that, I do not see much of a connection.
Do we have more questions, especially in the back? I can't see all that well, but yes, right here.
James Sang. I think you agree that the internet is a disruptive technology, and it's generally a rule that smaller organizations respond better to disruptive technologies than large organizations, and governments, of course, are an example of large organizations. In what ways is responding to the challenge of the internet going to be disruptive for countries like, internally disruptive for countries like Iran and China and Russia? I
think they are actually adapting much better than I think most of us thought in the past. And I'm too young to speculate about the thoughts 2 decades ago, but I had to go and read many of those early assumptions and predictions, and I think the assumption was that they either cut down the internet completely and they start censoring everything that contains words democracy and human rights, or something that is threatening to them, or the economy collapses because there was a lot of this. You will know this, a lot of this talk about the information revolution and globalization, and you needed networks and you needed access to technology and information in order to grow. And I think a lot of that discourse survived more or less up until 2005, 2006, and up until now. I mean, you go and reread The World is Flat by Thomas Friedman now, and it's still very much a view of information transforming governments and governments unable to cope with the threat. I think these governments have actually adopted to this new world much better, and some of it happened because they delegated the cost to the private sector. So they had companies that came to make money in these countries to more or less take on the costs of censorship or surveillance. It's Chinese private internet companies which are tasked by law with removing unlawful content from the website. So the government itself doesn't really have to hire a staff of 500 people to do that. The companies are the ones who need to take care of that. But another thing which I think is happening, and which is probably one of the more provocative ideas in the book, is that there is also a greater degree of customization in censorship that is happening right now. We are beginning to see smarter systems emerging to basically make a decision on the spot what needs to be censored and what doesn't need to be censored, based not only on the content that is being accessed, but also on the identity of the user who is trying to access the information. So my prediction is that what we will be seeing is, in a country like China, you'll see that investment bankers who do contribute to the growth of the economy will be able to access any website they want, because you can actually monitor their internet use. They access a lot of Financial Times and Reuters and Bloomberg. They have other investment bankers as their friends on LinkedIn and Facebook, right, and they look trustworthy. On the other hand, if you look at what human rights activists would be able to access, it will be the local government-made internet, so because they visit suspicious websites and they have other human rights activists as their online friends. And of course, this will help the governments to escape this problem of, it's been dubbed the dictator's dilemma, where dictators either have to censor the internet or they have to let it in and, basically suffer the consequences. They can still let the internet in, but be much more, selective about who gets to browse what. And all of that is driven by the same logic that, digital advertising is driven. It's all about customization. It's all about showing you the ad which corresponds to your previous surfing and browsing experience, right? The only difference is that instead of showing you the most relevant ad, you'll just be banned access to the most relevant page. But the logic is more or less the same, and all of that logic is what drives actually modern capitalism now. It's all about customization, and that's one way in which governments manage to adapt to this new environment.
Great. So you need to be a subversive thinking investment banker in China in order to become a democracy activist in the future.
Yes, I think that's the future of change, by investment bankers.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll see if they censor that or not. I think we have time for probably one or two more questions. Do you have anyone in the
Oh, no, there are.
Okay, yes, here.
Hi, Evgeny. Sam DuPont from NDN. I write the blog Global Mobile. And I'm nearly done with the book and enjoying it very much. And my question for you has to do with the State Department's missteps as you describe them. And I think you do a good job of popping the bubble of utopianism that has surrounded the technology. And I guess my own feeling about the State Department's work is that what they've been trying to do is introduce an old-fashioned bureaucracy into new technology. And their missteps have been caused, if anything, by a sort of excess of success in kind of bringing this technology to the work of other departments. And I think you do a good job of describing the mistakes they've made. And I'm wondering how you would... You don't necessarily in the book get too much into prescriptions for further,
That's in the chapter you haven't reached yet.
Okay. I want to just give you this opportunity to, if you do have ideas about how they could do a better job, how they would go about it, basically.
Sure. Well, I think we touched upon that briefly when we talked about the idea of cyber realism. To me, I try to be as much country and government independent, so to say, not specific as possible in the book, because I think what we need to get right are the principles, not the particulars according to which governments will be promoting or defending internet freedom. So, it's not just America that is trying to do that. You also, now have for example, the Dutch government, which is extremely interested in the problem of internet freedom, and you got, many other European governments who are interested in helping to promote it. So the way in which I end up describing that in the book is not a description of the internal bureaucracy in the State Department and whom to hire, whom to fire, and who need to get more funds. It's a broader kind of abstract framework and approach. And as I've said, I do believe that much here depends on whether there is a centralized approach to a subject like internet freedom, whether it's a bit more decentralized and you have local regional desks empowered over decision making, making decisions as to whether the internet is transforming China or Azerbaijan or Russia or Belarus, whether not. Because I think those are the people who are in a much better position to assess the actual impact of the internet on those countries than people who know everything about the internet. You can read technology blogs all day and still know nothing about the role of nationalism or religion, and in a country like Belarus or pick any country in the Middle East, right? So much of it has to do with the kind of internal structuring of kind of how do you actually learn. A lot of this is epistemological stuff. How do you actually learn about the way in which internet is transforming the world? Because my own experience is that the reason why there is so much cyber utopianism these days is because the media, because of its various internal structures, has just been much more focused on highlighting the positive changes in places like Russia or China or Iran, in part because often it's the pro-Western democratic bloggers who are the only ones who want to speak to Western media. Right? You do not necessarily run into conservative Iranian bloggers who want to talk to BBC, in part because that will get them in prison. And then the second reason is because they just denounced BBC as, CNN for that matter, as, an agent of imperialist West. So the stories we get to hear about those bloggers all have to do with bloggers promoting the interests of civil society and secular culture, and whatnot. So I think, my sort of overarching point is that we do need, whatever framework we end up deciding on, we do need to be extremely careful about the processes by which we learn, by which we decide, by which we make decisions. And I think once we have all of those in mind, we can then start thinking who needs to get more funds, who needs to get more power, and whether we need actually someone who will be highlighting the role that American companies are playing in this, or should we just rather let American companies do the job without necessarily publicizing the connection to the U.S. government, right? So that's sort of the meta level. I mean, there are many problems I outlined in the book, like the growth in cyber attacks on the websites of dissidents and NGOs, which are global problems in nature. I mean, they do require solutions which will involve multiple countries, multiple internet service providers, will require much more work that can be done by a single regional unit watching, Russia, or watching even, an issue, human rights or whatnot. But I think they will just need perhaps a slightly different mechanism, but I do not think that the presence of those 4, 5, 6, whatever global problems that do require a global solution would justify, an entirely internet-centric, as I call it in the book, approach to thinking about the political power of the internet.
Right. Well, I think that's probably a perfect note for us to end on. And I've always thought that it was, absolutely rich justice that somebody who comes from Belarus and who's thought so deeply about this sort of failed utopia of the 20th century should be guiding us through our, or I should say, pushing us against our own utopian impulses when it comes to the big story of the next century. So thank you so much, Evgeny. It's a great book, and you can follow him on Twitter. You can follow him on Foreign Policy. He's doing a big book tour everywhere. The profile coming up in The Guardian tomorrow says that Evgeny is leading an entire generation towards a new future of cyber realism. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm sure
that was the Julian Assange profile.
Right, they missed the headlines. They switched the headlines. But I think this book is, as you can see from tonight's discussion, going to get a lot of attention. And I think you can pick up copies out there, and hope you'll stay for some wine. And thanks once again to our hosts at New America and to Evgeny.
Thank you.
Thank you.